I am a little bit stymied at what you might want to stay seated any longer to hear about. So um, I, Bob asked me to sort of build the bridge between K to 12 and post-secondary and talk about the mediation service that I'm piloting this year. But I think we probably need to talk just briefly, and I'll try to keep it really short, about service provision in post-secondary, because without that link, we don't really get to being mediating anything, because that's where the problems come up, right? So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about what it looks like in post-secondary, and then we'll talk about mediation. And I think both of our earlier speakers have laid the groundwork really nicely for talking about mediation, because I think both talking about a proactive and preventive approach where you have to speak truth to power. The way you do that, I think, is often when you're sitting down trying to make sure that our clients are heard. It's their truth that we need to speak to power. And sometimes that ends up in either an advocacy session or a mediation where somebody has that structured opportunity to hear the truth of the people that we support. So I'm going to go there, but first I want to go through how you get to a problem before you get through it in post-secondary. If there's anything, because I know you've been sitting for a long time and lunch is like right outside the door, I'm feeling a real sense of competition here. So I just want to say, if anybody really desperately needs to eat, I'm not going to be offended if you have to go out and nibble, because this is getting onto a long time. And if there are questions you really have about post-secondary, feel free to ask those too, because I'm going to make it kind of short going through that section. Okay. Any questions or burning issues right off the bat? No. Great. Thank you for coming back from the break. You know, the last speaker's always like, are they ever going to come back at all? So I appreciate it. Okay. Oh no, it makes that awful noise. Tech help, please. How do I turn that awful noise off? So we'll talk briefly, and I'll keep it really short, about the provincial legislation, because we just covered all that and you guys know that really well. We'll talk about documentation of disability in post-secondary, which is really important in the transition from high school to university. Thank you. And we'll talk about what accommodation is and is not in post-secondary, and what services are available, and how we a model for mediation. So the legislation, yeah, you know this slide. You all could have written it, about guidelines for accommodation being that you have to be proactive, you have to do it individually. The individual piece I want to mention comes from actually the Charter, Section 15.1, that requires that accommodation be done with dignity. And in order to do things with dignity and respect, you have to do them individually. So that's a little link I wanted to tie up there. And we've talked a lot about the point of undue hardship, so I won't go there. But without compromising essential requirements is a very critical piece in post-secondary. Because we're looking at professional certifications, and because we're looking at a lot of practicum work, there are things sometimes that can't be accommodated because they have to be done the way they have to be done as a bona fide requirement. So essential requirements is usually the pin on which accommodation turns in post-secondary. Because as we talked about earlier, the undue hardship piece in post-secondary is pretty much impossible to demonstrate because the buck stops at the operating grant of the university. And so the university has a lot more discretionary funding and ways of constructing its money and spending it than school boards do, probably. And so that's why my question earlier about where the buck stops came up, because the commission has told us the buck stops at the deepest pocket, which is the university's operating grant. So when faculty come to us and say, oh, it's going to cost too much time and money for me to write a second midterm, or they say we can't afford a proctor for this exam or this software program or this interpreter or whatever, we just turn to them and say, and how big is your operating grant? So in that sense, Bob, yes. The other piece that I think is going to be really positive, and in looking at how we're looking at more positive approaches and not just defining exclusion, but looking at defining and creating inclusion, the AODA I think is going to give us a lot of room with that, because we're setting out standards about inclusivity. And in one of my other roles, I'm a law student writing a paper on why the Human Rights Commission paradigm really doesn't meet our needs. So that's another session. But I'm hoping that what will move in that direction is away from the stick model and towards the carrot. So I really see the AODA and the standards that are coming out of that as the carrot towards which we can strive to make a more inclusive world, instead of always saying, look how you excluded me. So I think a lot of what we all talk about in working with students is that equal opportunity means striving for the same opportunities and the same achievement without doing it in exactly the same way. So it's the same objective that we're aiming for, achieved in a different manner. And students with disabilities have to meet the same entrance criteria and academic standards as other students, but they may go about it in a different way. So as I mentioned earlier, the accommodations can't compromise bona fide requirements, but what are those and how are those defined is really the critical piece. That's where the disability offices sit down with faculty and say, so why are you having this person write an exam with a ballpoint pen? Why is that essential? Yeah, well, it's not. We don't teach handwriting in post-secondary, we use keyboards. So the other piece, I was asked at one point to be on a committee called the Accommodation and Remediation Committee. And I tell this story with some cynicism, I guess, because they're not the same. And the reason this has a medical example is because it was in a medical practicum setting where we need to distinguish between accommodation, which is enabling someone to do something in a different way when they have the fundamental competence to do that, and remediation, where the fundamental competence isn't there yet, and you're still in a teaching mode. You're remediating a skill set. You're not just doing that skill in a different way. And the example I use here is using an amplified stethoscope. If you have a medical student who is trying to listen to heart sounds, the accommodation is when they know what the heart sounds are, they know what they should be like, but they can't quite hear them with the standard stethoscope, so you give them an amplified stethoscope. Remediation is when you don't know what those sounds should be like in the first place. And that's about teaching and skill, and you may need an amplified stethoscope there too, but that's the difference between accommodation and remediation. And so I said to this committee, you got to split this committee in half, because we're talking about people with fundamental competence who need to be accommodated. Your remedial department, that's called tutoring, clinical skills. You get your academic instructional staff to handle that. Accommodation is a different game. We're talking about people who can. So what services are available to students with disabilities in post-secondary? Exam accommodations, pretty standard stuff. Assessment, materials in alternate format, tutors and mentors, note takers, assistive technology. You know, what I like to say to parents who come to me in my day job, which is as Disability Services Advisor to Queens, and they say, what services will you offer? And the first question is, what does your student need? And what is their curriculum? Because it's all about taking the student and the skills they bring to the setting, taking the curriculum and saying, what does it require, and building a bridge that enables that student to participate. And if we've never done it before, and we've never had to hire somebody who does that piece, or we don't have that software, or we haven't got a ramp in that building, that doesn't stop it, that starts it.